I think it was Albert Einstein that said that if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it well enough. So, with that in mind, I decided to record this video to demonstrate some of the ways that research is actually quite simple, yet sometimes the terminology can make it appear as though it's much more complex than it actually is. So we'll talk about this document, which I've linked in the description. It's a one-page document, and it has 3 columns, as you can see. The first column will be the English term, essentially just everyday language that you likely use already. And then the second column relates to the research translations of those everyday terms, as in what they would be called if you were either writing or reviewing a research article. And the third column are just examples of those research-related translations, connecting the English language to the research language. Now, if you've ever sat in any of my classes, you know that I ask my students to approach the topic of research as though it is a foreign language, because research in general is the most natural topic. Everything pertaining to research are things that you've been doing your entire life anyway. We're just calling it something different now. So if you're learning a new language, let's say French or Spanish, let's say, now you're connecting those English terms that you may have grown up with to French terms that now you're learning how to use. And of course, each language has their own nuances, so research is no different in that regard. So if you approach the concept and the topic of research as though it's a foreign language, then I think you'll be better off for it, because you're doing the same things. It's a very natural subject, the most natural, in fact. But the terminology associated with it can appear to be more complex than it actually is. So I'll get right into it. The first English everyday vernacular that you might be using will be who. The question of who in research is termed as a sample. And here you'll see that the example that I've chosen for the sample are graduate school students age 18 plus. Then the English term what. The question of what includes a little bit of nuance, as you can see, because it's not a direct translation. Who is obviously the sample. You'll see down below where is the setting, when is the frequency and duration. But when it comes to the what, there is some nuance there, and you're going to have to answer more of these questions in that what category. And then what is then translated into variables, research questions, null hypotheses, and directional hypotheses. So as an example, or as several examples here, since what is the most nuanced of the research translations, I've shown you using the graduate school students as, adult graduate school students as a sample. The variables here will be age, gender, temperature in the classroom, and classroom lighting. And then the dependent variable here will be student performance. So you see, age is an independent variable, gender is an independent variable, temperature here is an independent variable, classroom lighting is an independent variable, and student performance is the dependent variable. The independent variables, just as a definition, independent variables are any variables that you either control or control for. Now here we have more nuanced language, right? You hear control and you also hear control for, and you think they must be the same thing. That's not the case at all. Independent variables like temperature, for example, I can control in the classroom. There's usually most of the classrooms that I've taught in, there's usually something that I can adjust where I can increase the temperature in the classroom or decrease the temperature in the classroom. So I can manipulate, I can control the temperature in my classroom. I can also control the classroom lighting in my classrooms. Sometimes I'll turn some of the lights off for certain videos. On a bright sunny day, I'm very nature oriented. So if we have a bright sunny day, I'll just turn all the lights off and we'll just let the natural light come in my classes. So I can control the classroom lighting there. However, I cannot control someone's gender and I cannot control someone's age. Yet they are still independent variables. What I can do is control for someone's age. Like, for example, if you're obviously 18 plus, right? So if you're between the ages of 18 and 30, then I'll group you into one category. If you're between the ages of 30 and 40, I'll group you into another category. Between the ages of 40 and 50, I'll group you in a different category. So even though I can't tell you what age to be, I can control for your age. So essentially, I can't control your age, but I can control for your age by grouping you based on age, thereby making it an independent variable. Gender is the same thing. I can't tell you what gender to be. I cannot tell you what gender to be, and therefore I can't control your gender, but I can control for your gender. I might have male, female, other. It might be more nuanced than that, but essentially I can group you, I can control for your gender, but I cannot control your gender, thereby still making it an independent variable. The dependent variable is sometimes called the outcome variable. Some studies you might actually see it called the outcome variable. So here in this example, student performance is the dependent variable. That's the variable that I am trying to study by controlling and controlling for these other variables. So essentially age, gender, temperature, and classroom lighting are the independent variables that I'm either controlling or controlling for. And by doing so, I'm trying to see how student performance is impacted, how the controlling and controlling for those independent variables correlates with an increase or a decrease potentially in student performance, or maybe it just stays the same and there's no correlation whatsoever, right? So these are my variables, and I've deemed them to be independent, 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 and dependent. So you're going to want to do that as well, when you're completing this worksheet, if your professor asks you to, of course. Next, after the variables, we have the associated research questions. As you can see, if age is one of my independent variables, my research question then would be, does age correlate with student performance? This, again, age is my independent variable. Does age, there I have my independent variable, correlate with, there I have my dependent variable, student performance? Gender then would be, naturally, does gender correlate with student performance? And there's my independent variable with gender, and there's my dependent variable with student performance. Temperature in the classroom, does temperature correlate with student performance? There you have your independent variable of temperature, and then your dependent variable of student performance. Does classroom lighting correlate with student performance? There is my independent variable of classroom lighting, and my dependent variable of student performance. So with research questions, you're essentially just filling in the blanks here. Does blank independent variable correlate with blank dependent variable? And here the dependent variable happens to be student performance, and the independent variables differ. There are 4 of them that I've listed here, but you'll essentially be doing the same for the studies that you complete in your courses. The null hypothesis then is also filling in the blanks. The null hypotheses are where you're going to be filling in the blanks. Essentially, the blanks are blank independent variable does not correlate with blank dependent variable. That's all you're doing with your null hypothesis. You're just filling in the blanks. So here, again, using the same variables, age, gender, temperature, and classroom lighting, the first null hypothesis I have would be age does not correlate with student performance. The next null hypothesis I have is gender does not correlate with student performance. The next null hypothesis I have would be temperature does not correlate with student performance. And then finally, classroom lighting does not correlate with student performance. Now, it doesn't matter if you think they will correlate or you think they won't or will not correlate with the dependent variable. It does not matter if you believe or don't believe that the independent variable will or will not correlate with the dependent variable. This is just you filling in the blanks. And this is how you would do it. All research studies would have a null hypothesis. And of course, all research studies would then also have a directional hypothesis. And here, it's a little bit more complex. So depending on what kind of variable it is, and I've intentionally selected age, gender, temperature, and classroom lighting, so that I can demonstrate to you the different ways that directional hypotheses can be stated, because this is where it gets a little bit complex. Again, it's just a different language. Once you learn it, you've learned it. So directional hypothesis for age would be as age, independent variable, increases. Now here you have up and down. You could also write decreases. Then you have student performance, your dependent variable. And I've just chosen to go with increases. I could have also said decreases, right? So here, since age goes up and down, age can increase or decrease. And the dependent variable can also increase or decrease. Student performance, let's assume that we're thinking of student performance as your GPA. So here my directional hypothesis is as age increases, student performance increases. Now I might be wrong, but that's perfectly fine. It's a hypothesis. I'm not trying to market this as though it's true. Instead, as a researcher, I'm trying to see whether or not it is indeed true, and this is the statement that this is the hypothesis statement that I'm testing for, my directional hypothesis. Now here with gender, it's a little bit different because gender is not a variable that can go up and down. I can't say as gender increases. That doesn't make any sense. Well, as gender decreases, that also doesn't make any sense. Therefore, gender is a variable where we have certain categories, categorical variables, right? So being male, I've chosen, decreases student performance. You see, it's still a directional hypothesis because I'm showing direction in the independent variable and I'm showing direction in the dependent variable. I'm showing direction in the independent variable by selecting one of the choices within the independent variable category, here being male. And then I'm showing direction in the dependent variable by suggesting that being male, independent variable, decreases student performance. Then you have the dependent variable as well as the direction of the dependent variable, and just by selecting an independent variable, I've also shown directionality there as well. You always want to demonstrate that you've shown direction in both the independent variable and the dependent variable clearly. The next directional hypothesis we'll talk about pertains to temperature. And as you already know, temperature can go up and it can go down, right? Therefore, it's very much like age. And as a result, I've stated it just as I have with the age variable. You see, as temperature decreases, student performance increases. And look at the age directional hypothesis. As age increases, student performance increases. So they're stated in the same kind of way, because I don't have to select a particular temperature, 73 degrees, for example, which oddly enough is the perfect temperature for student performance based on some studies, but I digress. So I would write as temperature decreases, student performance increases. Now I could have also written as temperature increases, student performance increases, decreases. You have the freedom to select the directionality. You just have to make the choice directionality clear in your directional hypothesis statement. Finally, we have having all classroom lights on decreases student performance. Now, in some classrooms, there is the option of having an increase or a decrease in classroom lighting, where it'll be some of the lights, not all the lights, a few lights, no lights. Here I've assumed that you simply have an on and off switch in that classroom. You could write as classroom lighting increases, student performance increases or decreases. That would be fine too, but for this example, I'm just right now thinking about the primary classroom in which I teach, where it just has one switch. Either all the lights are on or none of the lights are on, right? So that's my assumption. But you may be in a different kind of classroom where you have a bunch of different switches where you can turn some of the lights on, some of the lights off, and choose to have all of them on or none of them on as well, right? So in that case, you could go with as classroom lighting increases or decreases, student performance then would increase or decrease. But here, being that this is a variable that I'm thinking of as on or off, having all classroom lights on decreases student performance is my hypothesis. Now, I don't personally believe this. I do believe that especially on a sunny day. I tend to teach primarily during the daytime. On a sunny day, natural light tends to increase student performance because you feel a little bit more of a connection with the material that's being covered. Again, that's just going off of some studies. Having all the classroom lights on tends to give it more of an institutional feel, which tends to disconnect students from the material being learned. But again, I digress. That's not what this is about. I've just chosen to, based on what I have learned about student performance, for my directional hypothesis to be having all classroom lights on, which is the directionality, meaning off, meaning on, that would decrease student performance. Essentially, what I'm saying is having all classroom lights off would increase student performance. That's another way of writing it as well. Okay, so that's the what category here. You'll see all the nuances there. Obviously, you're welcome to pause and rewind the video as many times as you'd like to gain a better understanding of these concepts: the variables, the research questions, the null hypotheses, and the directional hypotheses. Next, we have the where question. Where is this study taking place? In research, you'd call this the setting. And let's assume that somehow I created my own university and this study will be going on there, Nafis Alam University. So that'll be the setting. So if you see the word setting, you're essentially getting the answer to the question of where in a particular study. Now, if you're writing a research study instead of reading one, you might be asking, well, okay, so where is the setting in which I'll be collecting data? And instead of saying I've been collecting data in Nafis Alam University, you'd instead write the setting for data collection was Nafis Alam University. This way you're using research language, right? So you just want to be careful, be aware, and make sure to use the research language that we have listed here, that I have listed here. Next is the when question, and this pertains to the frequency and duration of your study. Here, I've just randomly chosen February 1st to March 31st, 2020, a duration of 60 days, cross-sectional, meaning for the cross-sectional part means that you collect data from one sample once, not more than once. Right? So that's all that cross-sectional means, and that is another thing that you'll have to know. It's the opposite of a longitudinal study. A longitudinal study will collect data from a particular group or a particular person for a longer period of time, but a cross-sectional study is when you collect data, in a limited period of time. So therefore, it would be a cross-sectional study. So the frequency and duration are the terms that you'd be using to answer the when question, and here I've chosen to go with February 1st to March 31st, 2020, a duration of 60 days, cross-sectional. The why question is covered in pre-existing research that justifies your study. This would be the literature review. Your literature review that you're writing, or a literature review that you're reviewing within an article that you're reading right now, that literature review aims to answer the why question. So again, in English, you'd think of it as why, and in talking research, you'd call it a literature review. Here, I've just given a quick example. Literature suggests that gender and classroom lighting impact student performance. This study is designed to assess the validity of existing research. There's little research on the potential impact of age and temperature on student performance. This study is then designed to fill these gaps in literature. You see, I'm justifying the reasoning for this research study. I'm telling you why I'm curious about it, and I'm also telling you why you should be curious about it, although I can't control whether or not you're curious about a certain topic. I'm sort of giving you an idea of why I'm curious about a particular topic, and you, of course, have the choice of being curious for the same reasons, for different reasons, or not curious at all. Right? So that's the why question. And then the how question is your methodology. Now, this will be a very detailed section. So even though you see one word, methodology, within methodology, there is a great deal of information that you're going to be putting down. This may, in fact, be one of your longer sections if you're writing a research study. Here, the example I've used is data for this cross-sectional, right? Cross-sectional is the opposite of longitudinal, where you're not collecting, long-term data. Exploratory meaning that this is a study that's being done for either the first time or one of the first time. You're essentially saying, by writing the word exploratory, that not much literature exists on this particular topic, and therefore it is exploratory. Some other options would be descriptive and explanatory. You'd conduct a descriptive study if there's some information on that particular topic and you're just trying to connect some dots there. And you'd conduct an explanatory study once there's plenty of information on a particular topic, and now you're really making predictive statements, inferential statements, or you're aiming to anyway, by conducting the study that you're doing. So the exploratory, descriptive, explanatory parts just indicate how far along the growing body of research in that particular topic area is at the time. Of course, this is a quantitative study. The opposite would be qualitative. So you have quantitative studies that are, more closed-ended questions, more about numbers, and qualitative studies that are more open-ended and a lot more about writing. Will be collected through questionnaires administered at the Student Center of Nafis Salam University, right? So this questionnaires is the tool that I'll be using. The research tool here would be the research questionnaires administered at the Student Center of Nafis Salam University. And there, of course, is the setting. Convenience sampling will be used to recruit research subjects. So here I've chosen to go with convenience sampling. You can go with different kinds of sampling. I'll make a separate video on sampling at a future date. But here I've chosen to go with convenience sampling to describe my methodology as to how I'll be conducting this research study, right? The methodology answers the how question. How and methodology are the same thing in this regard. So convenience sampling will be used to recruit research subjects. Data will then be analyzed through SPSS and disseminated through publications, hopefully, more than one publication possibly, who knows, right? So convenience sampling will be used to recruit research subjects. That's the sampling technique that I'll be using. And data will be analyzed through SPSS. That's the program I'll be using. And disseminated through publications, showing that my goal is to share the data that I've collected and analyzed, share that data through some academic articles that I may write. I could also write disseminated through presentations as well. Maybe I could write also through publications and presentations. That might make a lot of sense as well. But yeah, that's essentially it as far as the methodology is concerned. So these are the answers to the who, what, where, when, why, how questions, and how to ask these questions using research vernacular. So you have the sample related to the who, you have the variables, research questions, null hypotheses, directional hypotheses related to the what, the setting related to the where, the frequency and duration related to the when, pre-existing research that justifies your study, otherwise known as a literature review, related to the why, and your methodology is how you're going to be conducting the research that you're doing. Now, in a clinical setting, I should say, the PICO framework tends to be a go-to. So I wanted to take a quick moment to give you some examples of how you'd make those statements using PICO. So this way you're covering all of the areas that you'd need to check all the boxes for the PICO. PICO stands for person, which will be your sample, your intervention, your independent variable, your comparison, which is optional, and your outcome, which is your dependent variable. Here, you'll see that there are some with green, the comparison, and some that are not. So I'll just explain those real quickly. So all of these statements will start with the person, PICO, person. So for graduate students, for graduate students, for graduate students, for graduate students. That's how all of these statements begin. Now, for the topic of classroom lighting, I've gone with, is there a correlation between classroom lighting and student performance? So this is a PICO framework manner of asking these questions. For graduate school students, is there a correlation between classroom lighting and student performance? Using that same PICO framework, for graduate school students, is there a correlation between temperature and student performance? You'll see that there is no comparison groups here. There are no comparison groups here. It's just the sample, graduate school students, and whether or not there's a correlation between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Classroom lighting being the independent variable, temperature being the independent variable, and student performance being the dependent variable. Next, we have, for graduate school students, is age a better predictor of student performance than gender? Read that very carefully. I've color-coded it for a reason. So for graduate school students that you already know, with PICO you start with the sample. Is age, which is my independent variable here, a better predictor of student performance, which is my dependent variable here, than, right? The word than indicates that you're comparing it to something, comparing age to now gender. And by asking this question in this kind of way, you're asking, for graduate school students, is age a better predictor of student performance than gender? As in, does age determine student performance more accurately than does gender? We don't know, but that's the question you're asking in the PICO framework. And finally, for graduate school students, is gender a better predictor of student performance than age? You'll see that the sample is listed here. The intervention, or the person, which is the sample, is listed here. The intervention, which is the independent variable, is listed here. The comparison, which is the optional variable, independent variable, is listed here. And the outcome, the dependent variable, is listed here. So essentially, for graduate school students, is gender a better predictor of student performance than age? So that's the PICO framework that many clinical faculty and students tend to use. So I did want to add that on here rather than just closing it out with the methodology section. So again, I've included this document both as a Microsoft Word document as well as a PDF in the description section of this particular video. So you're welcome to download it, use it as a worksheet. If you can answer these questions, if you can fill in these blanks, you should be in good shape as far as the questions that you need to have answered. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.